guys and gals, me Mutahar, and Google is actually considered a convicted monopoly, ladies and gentlemen. Now, to give you guys an idea about it, this is a massive L day for Google as one of the largest tech companies in the world. Now, for anybody that hasn't been following things going on, it kind of feels like we've been in a time portal and we went all the way back to the early 2000s, okay, late 90s. When the whole world of antitrust was a thing, when these tech companies were getting so big that they effectively dominated entire markets. Now, to give you guys a quick idea, okay, to give you an understanding of how search engines work, what do you use to search on the internet? Is it Google? Is it Bing? Well, out of those two options, I would wager that 99.9% of my audience does not use Bing. According to StatCounter, 91% of the internet search engines are, the people using search engines are using Google, okay? The rest, 3.8% is using Bing. After that, you got Yandex, you got Yahoo, Baidu, DuckDuckGo, so on and so forth. Out of all the browsers in the world, 65% of those browsers are Chrome-based browsers. 18% are Safari-based browsers. People who just use the default browser on their iPhone or their MacBook. Edge, 5.2%, which is basically just Chromium. Firefox, FurryFox, 2.7%. Samsung Internet, 2.5%. Opera, and I assume that also involves Opera GX, 2%. So yeah, you can sit at this point and wonder, wow, there's a lot of Chrome usage on the internet. There's a lot of Google usage on the internet. The top website on the world is google.com. So to give an idea, the United States basically went to task with Google and effectively said that they had broken the law to maintain an online search monopoly. One US judge actually rules. That judge in particular said that Google violated Section 2 of the Sherman Act. Now, the Sherman Antitrust Act, all the way back to 1890, is basically an act that the U.S. Congress had passed to prohibit monopolies. So basically, one company running an entire industry, right? And obviously, monopolies are terrible. To give you an idea of why competition is needed, let's look at the last video that I kind of did, or one of the last videos, where we talked about the Intel mess-up. Now, if Intel screws up, who is their only other competitor in that processor space, right? The x86 space, AMD. Imagine if Intel shuttered. Well, if there's only one other company that's producing the processors we use in our big gaming computers, well, they don't really have a reason to be doing anything to advance their game. If you're the only person in town, why even bother innovating and advancing? If you can be one company that just buys out every other company or stifles any innovation, then congratulations, you can now control a market and stifle the market and any innovation that comes with it. Which is why laws like this exist, to prevent that from happening. Now, according to this, Section 2 says every person who shall monopolize or attempt to monopolize or combine or conspire with any other person or persons to monopolize any part of the trade or commerce along with several states or with foreign nations shall be deemed guilty of a misdemeanor and on conviction thereof shall be punished by fine not exceeding $5,000. Yeah, this is for 1890, okay? $5,000 back then, that was a lot of candy. Or by imprisonment not exceeding 1 year. Or by both said punishments in the discretion of the court. So I decided to actually read through all 286 pages of this post. And there were a few things, one primarily that caused Google to be at the crosshairs of the US government. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the word defaults. Now, before we begin, I want to ask you a question. How many times have you installed a browser or unlocked purchased a phone, whether it be iPhone or Android, and thought, yeah, maybe I'll change the default search engine or the default browser? I guarantee you, if you're a casual iPhone user, you probably use a Safari browser, and there's really no reason for you, if you live in the United States, to download other browsers. They're all just Safari with a different skin. If you're on Android, you probably use whatever bundled browser that comes with your specific Android OS package, right? That's it. People use defaults. There's a good chance that if you download a certain browser on the internet, you probably use a default search engine. That default search engine probably ends up being Google. So when looking through this actual lawsuit, what they had basically said was Google has a major unseen advantage over its rivals. And mind you, the only real rival that Google has is fucking Bing. And Bing is just a fraction of competition in the space. So what they said was they had default distribution. So most users access a general search engine, a GSE, and a GSE is effectively just Google, Bing, Yandex, DuckDuckGo, something that you would use to browse for web pages and information on the internet. Not a search for something like YouTube videos or TikTok or whatever. So most users use a general search engine through a browser like Apple Safari. So when you're actually opening up your web browser, chances are you click on the URL bar and you type in your search query, and that goes to Google and it will search for you, right? That's how most people use browser. You don't go to google.com on your phone and actually enter in whatever you want. You just type in the URL bar what you want to search for. So what they said that because this comes preloaded, these search access points are preset with a default search engine. That default is extremely valuable real estate, and we'll find out how valuable just now. Many users simply stick to searching with defaults. Google receives billions of queries every day through those access points. Google derives extraordinary volumes of user data from such searches. It then uses that information to improve search quality. Google so values such data that absent a user-initiated change, it stores 18 months worth of user search history and activity. So what they said was the distribution agreement benefits Google in another important way. More users in their search engine means more advertisers. And the more advertisers you have, the more revenue you generate. So queries on Google have grown, so too has the amount it earns in advertising dollars. In 2014, Google booked $47 billion in ad revenue, which is a lot of money, obviously. In 2021, that number increased to threefold, over $146 billion. Bing, by comparison, generated only a fraction of that amount, meaning less than $12 billion in 2022. So you can see just how Google's next largest competitor is absolutely scraping for nickels. Now, is Microsoft going to go bankrupt over this? Obviously not. But it shows you that even a company as large as Microsoft, in some cases larger than Google or Alphabet, is still struggling to fight in the search space. Imagine how many computers come preloaded with Windows these days. And even though Edge comes preloaded on Windows devices that has, Bing built in, most people load up Edge to download Chrome and then immediately just start using Google, as a default access point in the Chrome browsers. So what it says is Google pays massive sums to secure those preloaded defaults. Usually the amount is calculated as a percentage of the advertising revenue that Google generates from queries run through a default search access point, and that is known as revenue share. In 2021, those payments totaled more than $26 billion. And that is 4 times more than any of Google's search-specific costs combined. So what that basically means is when you, as a big company like Apple, for instance, sign up to provide those default spaces, Google sweetens the pot by saying, hey, listen, as we generate money, we're going to give you a percentage of all the money we generated. This means that for a lot of these big companies like Apple, who can easily make their own search engine, probably think, hey, it's a lot easier for us to just let Google do their thing, and we make billions of dollars literally by letting them exist in our space as a default option. So for Google and Apple specifically, the ISA agreement, as this alleges, is an agreement between Google and Apple, where Google pays Apple a share of its search ads revenue in exchange for Apple basically letting Google be the default out-of-box option for its mobile and desktop browser, Safari. So obviously, Google says that this is due to Apple's very sizable and valuable user base, which Apple basically controls all the distribution of. So to give an idea of how much money Google is paying Apple just for that real estate, let me show you here. So according to the revenue share, in return for exclusive default placements, Google pays Apple a certain redacted percentage of its net ad revenue, which amount, at least in 2022, to $20 billion. And that is almost double the payment Google had made in the year 2020, which was, at the time, 17.5% of Apple's operating profit. Google pays Apple more in revenue share than it pays every other partner combined. If Apple were at all inclined to enter the market for search, it would have to be prepared to lose those massively large revenue share payments. So again, if Apple could easily make a search engine, right? And to think about it, Apple made a mapping software, Apple Maps, which now is pretty much on par used as a default as compared to Google Maps on iPhone devices. So Apple could easily make their own search engine. But are they willing to give up a significant pot of cash that they probably use to operate and build new iPhones and new technology off of? Think about it. So according to Apple, they said the market reality is that Google is actually really the only real choice as a default. So there is no price that Microsoft could ever offer Apple to preload Bing. Mozilla actually also stated something similar. Now, if you use Firefox, you probably are wondering, well, Muda, how much money is Firefox even getting from Google? Yes, Firefox also gets paid from Google, to the point where it is most of their operating revenue, it seems. So according to Mozilla's finances, most of their revenue comes from Google. In fact, in 2022, it was actually 81% of their revenue. So if you actually look at it, right, 2005, 95% of their revenue was from Google, where they got $50.3 million, according to their actual independent auditing list. Now you might be like, whoa, does that mean Firefox is basically owned by Google? No, listen, back in 2008, what had happened was Mozilla kept extending more and more of these lucrative deals. And according to Mozilla's CEO, what they basically said was they're just happy about the relationship with Google. What they also said is, we develop our product and technical direction as part of this open process unrelated to that relationship with Google. We talk to Google about parts of the products that offer Google services and the services they provide, like anti-phishing. Otherwise, Google doesn't have any special relationship to their project activities division, meaning that basically all Google does is write a fat check that says, hey, Firefox, just make us your default. And that's pretty much how Firefox effectively gets a lot of its revenue that they use to sustain their company, pay their employees, and pay for developing their browser. So in a lot of ways, what has basically been the context of all of this is Google effectively pays a shit ton of money in order to just be the default option for everyone. So a quick context here is when you purchase an iPhone or purchase an Android device, and I'm going to stick to cell phones here primarily, if you go to your browsers, you can go to the settings tab, you can go to the Safari page, and you can basically check that in the default search engines, Google is the one with that blue tick. But there are other defaults. If you wanted to use Yahoo for whatever reason, that's it right there. Bing, DuckDuckGo, you probably don't even realize, but there is another option that I just found out literally right now, known as Ecosia. So again, Google is primarily the default because they pay up the ass to be the default person out there. Now, on one hand, I would say that Google probably is the better search engine, even compared to something like Bing or Yahoo, obviously. But the reason why they've existed to be the largest person is that obviously they pay all these companies to be the default, and because they're the default, they have the lion's share of traffic. With that lion's share of traffic, they're able to better optimize their search engine and basically keep that monopoly going, which is exactly what the United States government has basically slapped them with. So this is where we sit at this sort of precipice, right? What happens now? So all of a sudden, is the US government going to put a gun to every other company's head and say, hey, you got to start giving more options? No, if Google is actually generating all this money and creating an environment where obviously these companies are more than happy to work with Google, even if they believe, yeah, they're the only player in town, there really isn't any actual relief that is basically being offered. Like, what is the actual thing that the government can force Google to do? And this is where people have started to look at the future. Now, in areas like Europe, there could be a default screen. So imagine if, as you fire up your smartphone for the first time, it basically says, hey, listen, which browser do you want to use? You don't have to be using Safari. You can download Edge, you can download Firefox, you can download Brave, you can download Opera. There are ranges of options. But how do we determine what the option should be? Should we allow every single browser project or only the ones that are the most popular? The other option is, as you fire up any browser, the government can basically mandate a lot of these companies to ask you what your default search engine should be. Now, you could remain Google as your default, but if you are given the option, are you more likely to maybe try a different search engine, or are you going to stick to Google out of basic muscle memory? See, that could be an option where the government can basically say you can't pay to force your search engine and make it a default. It could also be a situation where the most aggressive ruling could happen, where the government can effectively sever the entire search portion of Google from the rest of the company and effectively break up this big tech organization and make it so that it doesn't exactly become the only player in town, which is effectively where Google is at right now. Look, it's pretty bad for Google to be effectively labeled an actual fucking monopoly. And you might be like, well, what about these other guys? What about Bing? Can't they? Here's the thing about monopolies. When you are this large, yes, the government specifically singles you out and basically wants you to be at the same level as everyone. In the government's mind, and in most people's mind, they would probably want, 50% of the world using Google and 50% of the world fucking using Bing. We don't live in that world, okay? We live in a world where 90% of the online search world is dominated by Google. Now, how much of that is going to be the case going forward with Google search noticeably dropping in quality? I've even made a video about that like a month ago. But what about the world of AI searches in the future, where maybe Microsoft could be the dominant platform going forward if using their ChatGPT systems are able to actually produce a better search result than whatever Google is shitting out these days. Now, could Microsoft spend double the amount of money that Google does in order to have their default Bing engine be around the world? Sure, easily. But that would also require companies willing to, take Microsoft on and lose that juicy chunk of ad sharing revenue. It's a fucking complicated world that we're in. But yeah, it's one where the US government, at least in their eyes, has proven Google to be a convicted monopolist. And at this moment in time, what happens next? Well, Google might be able to appeal it, or Google might actually have to break their search engine up. And in effect, I believe this might lead to a whole bunch of dominoes falling for the entire industry going forward. But honestly, from a user perspective, I love the idea of having more competition and more choice. And while it's touchy given the fact that, yeah, Google is a pretty decent player, and honestly, if most companies want to work with them, I actually don't see why they wouldn't. It makes sense. But do I want them to be broken up just so I can see there be more competition? Absolutely. And at some point, that requires the government to jump in and break up the massive tech cartel that we have running around and make it so that it's a little bit more fair for everyone and ultimately more innovative going forward. But that being said, let me know what you think about it in the comment section below. If you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Dislike it if you dislike it.